But welcome to today's webinar, Progress in Reducing Food Waste, where we dive into the annual impact report from the U.S. Food Waste Pact. I've hosted this event or our old regional version several times now, and it's one of my absolute favorite events of the year. So thank you for joining. We are going to cover the work of the U.S. Food Waste Pact and its signatories in 2025. We'll be diving into the second year of both national retail and national food service data, as well as discussing the trends coming out of that data. And then we'll take a look at the pilots that the Pact ran in 2025, broken down by our three main project areas. And we have some really exciting results to share from a few of those, so I'm excited for you to get to see that. And then we'll end by touching briefly on our plans for 2026 and beyond before we come back to your questions. And for those who've recently joined, please do feel free to submit questions through the chat or the Q&A function available through Zoom. Just to introduce myself, I'm Jackie Suggett. I am Vice President of Business Initiatives and Community Engagement here at ReFed, and I will be hosting the webinar today. As part of that, I'll share some of the latest stats and the current landscape of food waste more broadly, and then I'll pass it on to my other two colleagues on the screen here to really take us deep into the content of the discussion. Kristen Lee is Director of Business Initiatives at ReFed. They lead ReFed's work on the U.S. Food Waste Pact, and they'll be walking through the data components. And then Tara Dalton is Circular Supply Chain Manager for Food Loss and Waste team at World Wildlife Fund. And she'll be taking us through the results of our pilot projects that we ran, as well as talking about what's to come in 2026. Before we dive into that too deeply, I do want to set a foundation for food waste more broadly with what the latest data is saying about food businesses generally, and then where the Pact and our various programs come into play within that. According to ReFed's latest estimates, 29% of food produced in the US is going unsold or uneaten every year. So almost a third of food produced. Food waste has a wide ranging set of impacts for planet, people, and profit. For planet, food waste accounts for 9% of the country's methane production, and total greenhouse gas emissions from food waste are the equivalent of driving 51 million cars for a year. There's also a social impact with an estimated 115 billion meals, going to waste each year, which is enough to feed a third of the US population for an entire year. That is particularly painful, I think, and stark when you consider that in 2023, 1 in 7 Americans were food insecure. There's also a massive economic cost to wasting food, and that is of particular interest to our stakeholders and signatories within the Pact. Total food that goes unsold or uneaten, so not this chart, but total food going unsold or uneaten is valued at $384 billion, which is 1.3% of US GDP. What this chart is showing is for food businesses specifically. So this is including farm, manufacturing, food service, retail. That is valued at $243 billion, which presents obviously a huge economic opportunity for food businesses to especially be focusing on preventing food from going to waste in the first place, especially given the inflationary reality that we're in right now, supply chain disruptions, and more. We are going to talk about data that's specific to retail and food service sectors as we get into the webinar today. But just because we are focusing in on those two sectors and that we can track waste by those two sectors doesn't mean that that is happening within a vacuum. It's a systemic problem. Its causes are complex and sometimes interconnected and interrelated across the supply chain. And some of our whole chain pilots that we'll talk about later will demonstrate this interconnectedness really well. This is one of my favorite slides, but I also think it oversimplifies how clean these beautiful colored lines are of where food waste happens. Just to demonstrate that before we get into the discussion today, if a strawberry goes to waste on farm, it's not necessarily because it's moldy or there was a weather event on the farm, although both of those things can be true. But there are policies, behaviors, and decisions across this entire supply chain that can drive waste up and downstream. To continue with that strawberry example, there are both quality and aesthetic specifications that customers require for a strawberry to be sold, which means that a completely edible strawberry may never make it off the farm because it's discolored, misshapen, too small, etc. And those specifications are influenced by what you and I purchase in the store as consumers and where we spend our dollars. So a solution to that problem requires the whole chain, the whole supply chain, or one that involves multiple nodes of this supply chain across these beautifully colored bars. That is exactly the kind of impact that we hope to facilitate through the pact. By working with food businesses across the supply chain, especially those in that middle part between farm and consumers, we help signatories address food waste both in their operations and those larger systemic problems that no business can solve themselves. The pact is an initiative co-led by ReFed and World Wildlife Fund, and you'll hear from both of us throughout the course of today. And it focuses on a few key pillars: business activation through collaborative convenings, data and measurement to deliver actionable insights and benchmarking, thought leadership and storytelling to demonstrate the progress that we're making and motivate further action, and working across the broader ecosystem to share and scale learnings and impact. Overall, we aim to create a space where businesses can come together and discuss common challenges and learnings while also providing data and insights into that conversation to influence action to address food waste across the broader food system. Now that we are grounded in this topic more broadly, and how businesses fit into that, I am going to turn it over to my colleague Kristen to talk about progress from the last year.
Thank you, Jackie. So I will be walking us through progress on food waste nationally in the retail and food service sectors. But let's start with the overview of all the progress that the Pact and our signatories have made in this last calendar year. So we saw significant growth in our signatory base in 2025. As you can see in the gray box, the signatory base is doing a great job of embedding food waste goals and efforts into their operations, with the vast majority having dedicated food waste KPIs, offering standardized employee training around food waste, and engaging with their suppliers and helping spread food waste reduction practices up the supply chain. In the green box, you'll see Pact highlights. We ran 6 pilots in 2025, which Tara will talk about later, and we also launched 6 new resources, which we're really excited about. The Pact welcomed 14 new signatories in 2025, which nearly doubled the base. We had 16 at the end of 2024. Now we have 30. And what's really important to call out here is that we expanded business representation across the supply chain. We now have signatories who represent the grower producer node, and we welcomed our first distributor signatories as well. We saw a deepened engagement in the food service sector, so we added 2 signatories in the hospitality subsector, as well as 3 in QSR, or quick service restaurants. And this broader base really allows us to better permeate the food system, which is critical for making an impact on the systemic issues that Jackie just spoke about. A core pillar of the pact is data collection. So retail and food service signatories report food waste data to us each year, and we're able to use that data to see trends in those sectors on a national scale. And last year, we established baselines in both of these sectors, and this year we were able to establish a year-on-year trend, which we'll build upon in future years. These data sets are super important for determining what impact actions to address food waste are having in these sectors, and we're really proud of the fact that these data sets are best in class. And all the data that you're going to see here today is aggregated and anonymized from our reporting signatories. So let's go ahead and dive into the retail data first. The most important metric that we track in retail, which you can see here on this slide, is unsold food rate. And that actually represents the food waste reduction rather than market fluctuations or business performance. So the good news that we're seeing in retail is that unsold food rate decreased from 2023 to 2024, although we did see total tons wasted and lost sales increase. So this means that while market fluctuations and business performance across the sector resulted in more food passing through grocery stores, food waste is still decreasing based on the share of retail inventory that goes unsold. And the chart on the left shows the relationship between unsold food rate and tons from 2023 to 2024, and the chart on the right shows the relationship between unsold food rate and lost sales. We also collect destination data, to see which pathways wasted food is taking. So 2 pieces of great news from retailers this year are both in the donation rate and in the unknown rate. And as you can see, donations were up in 2024 comparatively to 2023. We like to see that. That is the most desirable pathway for food waste, for surplus food to take according to the EPA's wasted food scale. The unknown rate decreased as well, which is likely a sign of enhanced measurement practices and potentially indicates that food that ends up in landfills is being properly categorized. And you'll also notice that retailers reported a high composting rate as well. As Jackie mentioned, the food waste has a number of wide-ranging impacts, and this table summarizes some of those key metrics that we track year on year. Because of what I mentioned previously, that we saw an increase of food that moved through the system. Unfortunately, the environmental and economics of what we track increased, but we're excited to see that donated metric increase. And our retail signatories represent over 50% of US grocery market share. And we're grateful to be able to track this progress year over year and use the data in a positive feedback loop to not only inform signatory actions, but also for us as the pact to be able to better serve signatories. And with that, we will move on to food service. So first, I just want to level set on the data that's being represented in this slide. Currently, our food service data set only includes corporate dining signatory base, so that represents 81% of the US business and industry market share. And as we look at this data, it's only that segment. So there's likely a correlation that we also want to call out between reporting sites being high performers due to having implemented waste tracking as a common practice, as well as client food waste reduction goals, which can lead to higher performance in terms of a lower food efficiency rate. The most important metric that we track in the food service sector is the food efficiency rate. It quantifies food waste as a percentage of total food purchases. So a lower food efficiency rate indicates less food being wasted. And what you'll see here is that not only did the food efficiency rate decrease in this sector between 2023 and 2024, but the total tonnage and the wholesale cost of surplus food also decreased along with that. And that could point to greater operational efficiency between the 2 years, as well as improved data quality, which we always love to see. And so in the chart on the right, we can break down where that waste is happening on a departmental level. And overwhelmingly, we see that produce has the highest food efficiency rate. Great. So moving on to causes. So this is the first year that we received cause data from signatories, which allows us to dig into the reasons why food waste is occurring in these different departments. And having departmental and cause data linked provides really actionable information that businesses can use to target food waste. We saw that trimmings and byproducts were the leading cause of wasted food in food service overall, and that it accounted for almost 70% of the waste in the produce department. We collect destination data for food service as well. And last year, we noted that the composting rate was high and it increased between 2023 and 2024, which is good. Signatories correlated this high composting rate with reporting locations having access to municipal composting. And we note that this may not represent location access across the national average. You'll see that the landfill rate also went down. So these are both positive signs that waste is getting to a more desirable place. And now on to impact data for food service. We're seeing some exciting trends here in line with that tonnage decrease. So unlike retail, we're seeing that emissions and wholesale cost of surplus food decreased. So that is positive. And overall, the trends in both retail and food service point to continued progress on food waste. Our signatories are doing really incredible work day in and day out to make these trends that you're seeing on the screen a reality. So a huge shout out to them for making all of this work possible by reporting their data to us. Next year, we will have our third year of data in both of these sectors, so we'll be able to see an even larger arc of trends. And we're really excited by this data, and we have some more exciting data that we're able to share. So I'll pass that off to Tara, who will talk about the results of our pilots. Over to you.
Thanks, Kristen, and hi, everybody. I'm on the WWF team, and I want to share more about our pilots since 2025 was a big year in this area for a few different reasons. We were able to run one nationally scaled pilot in 2024, but 2025 was the first year that we really moved out of the West Coast and scaled all of our projects nationally. So, another shout out to all of our signatories and other food businesses that participated that year. Next slide. In 2025, we focused on building out our resources in addition to running pilots. In previous years, we had run three really successful employee engagement pilots in manufacturing. And then in 2025, the success caught the attention of our food service signatories, and we brought the tested strategies to that sector. We published the results in a case study, which you see on the left. And then to help companies with operationalizing the findings, we produced some detailed step-by-step guides for how to engage workers in food waste reduction efforts in kitchens. So those all live on the PACT website, and we encourage you to check out the link being shared now in the chat. Additionally, in March, we published our Employee Engagement Toolkit, which you may have heard us talk about previously on a webinar. This is an open source resource that is designed for all businesses in manufacturing, distribution, food service, and retail. We wanted to make these resources publicly available because this kind of work has yielded some of the best results across all pilot types. That success is enumerated in that big number in the bottom right. Across the 4 employee engagement pilots we've run to date, frontline workers have generated ideas that resulted in an average reduction of 66% in targeted commodities. Moving forward, we'd love to continue to see widespread adoption of this strategy across the food system and perhaps in different sectors like retail, because acting on employee ideas we see really works. Now for our whole chain work. We ran 4 whole chain pilots in 2025. 3 of those were what we call first phase whole chain pilots, in which we identify where the waste is occurring along the supply chain of one commodity. Those 3 commodities in 2025 were ground beef, yogurt, and bananas. We choose our commodities based on what the signatories are most interested in mapping and what we think will have the biggest opportunity for supply chain collaboration to reduce the food waste. So, in addition to mapping the waste hotspots, the first phase pilots also identified potential solutions. And for both beef and yogurt, we landed on changes in packaging as a high priority solution to combat waste. The banana results are forthcoming, but I will say that this was the first commodity we mapped with a global supply chain, so the results should be very interesting. And in 2025, we also launched a strawberries whole chain pilot part 2 that tested a solution to the on-farm strawberry loss identified in the first study. While we conducted the first phase pilot with retail, this second phase strawberry pilot took place in the food service sector. So I think it's just interesting to note that, like the employee engagement pilot that transferred from manufacturing to food service, this is another example of how the pact is helping different sectors learn from each other. So second grade strawberries typically go to waste because they don't meet certain aesthetic specifications, but they're perfectly edible. So we tested a solution that sent second grade strawberries to corporate dining sites where they were processed and used in new recipes. This pilot involved a lot of different companies and supply chain partners and had really exciting results, including increasing grower revenue by 80% and reducing on-farm strawberry waste by 51%. So in 2026, we look forward to continuing our whole chain work in new commodities and hopefully to inspire solutions adoption for these first phase pilots in beef and bananas. So stay tuned for that. Finally, our other project focus area in 2025 was low waste events. This is a new, or it was a new project area for us, but it's one with a lot of potential. So one challenge of making headway in food waste reduction in the hospitality industry is lack of measurement infrastructure. So one of our goals in this low waste events pilot was to collect data around the waste that was occurring. And we found some shocking statistics, like the amount of prepared food at buffets going uneaten, 42%, as you see on the slide there. And that only counts the food we were able to observe being wasted on the buffets. It did not include kitchen prep waste or plate waste, so the actual number is a lot higher. With the help of an ad hoc working group composed of industry experts, we also created a set of guidelines for event planners and venues that a conference or meeting style event could implement. And what was particularly unique about this pilot is that the guidelines for a low waste event are targeted at both the venues, like hotels and convention centers, and the event planners themselves. The planners, we realized, play a very important role in communicating and collaborating with the venue to make event decisions that will impact waste. But so often, we in the food waste space just focus our energies on the final source of the waste, the kitchens and service teams. But that venue planner collaboration is really key to making change and having a high impact. So, through the pilots, we targeted certain commonly high wasted categories of food and hospitality, including breads, dressings and sauces, and fruit. And we found that by implementing the guidelines, we were able to decrease waste in those categories by 55%. And you know what? They all still had leftovers in those categories at the end of the day. A common fear in hospitality is running out of food. You never want to run out of food and disappoint the client. And that's often a barrier to implementing food waste reduction strategies. But this pilot really showed that we have a lot of progress that can be made and waste reduced before we get even close to running out of food. The guidelines that were developed for this pilot will be published at the end of this month on our website, and an additional 10 or so resources will be published alongside those guidelines to help with operationalizing them. Our next goal is to scale the adoption of these guidelines across the hospitality industry to make them standard practice. We'll be doing some ambitious activations around these resources in the coming months, so stay tuned. And if you have any questions, you can email me about it. And I think my email is being shared in the chat now. We're already a few months into 2026, and some of this work is already underway. But generally, over the next several years, our focus will be on deepening engagement with our existing signatory base and driving solutions adoption. So one thing we didn't talk about yet was the convenings that our signatories participate in. They meet with each other at least twice a quarter, or once a quarter in our topic-based working groups, and then once a quarter in our industry-focused sector summits. These meetings follow antitrust guidelines and Chatham House rules to create open spaces for dialogue and sharing of best practices. This year, we're expanding our programming in these areas to include project-specific task forces and also ad hoc meetings around timely messages like policy and other waste communications. This expansion is just to make sure that we're meeting the needs of our signatories and providing as many opportunities as possible for them to collaborate and exchange ideas. And moving on to that middle column, this is just an illustrative list of projects we're exploring pursuing further. That includes scaling plans for our whole chain and low waste events project, and a potential new project to map diversion facilities across the nation with the purpose of connecting food businesses with these key resources. And lastly, we're going to continue something we started in 2025, which is to provide signatories with more connections to food waste policy. We see our role in this area as being one of an educator on the big changes constantly happening in the food waste policy space. We want our signatories to be armed with the right information to make their impacted operational changes effectively and efficiently. So to do this, we're partnering with the Zero Food Waste Coalition to help bring these educational opportunities to our signatories. And finally, the U.S. Food Waste Pact is part of the larger global Food Pact network, which is a group of food waste pacts from around the globe that gather regularly and exchange ideas and learnings about these kinds of initiatives. The network is run and facilitated by our friends at WRAP, and by participating, we hope to accelerate impact on a global scale. So that concludes the presentation portion of this webinar. Hopefully all of that information has sparked some ideas and questions, which we can answer now, and I'll turn it back over to Jackie.
Awesome. Thank you, Tara. Thank you, Kristen, for taking us through all that information. Before we dive into questions, I do want to introduce two more of our ReFed colleagues, David Lee and Jalen Knott, who have a lot of the data work that is part of the reports that have been discussed today. So they are joining in to answer the questions that the rest of us might not be able to answer if you want to get really deep into the data. So please do continue to submit questions through the Q&A function or the chat, but I'll go ahead and get started with a few that have already been sent in. And I am actually going to answer the first one, which was just we had several people ask about the deck being shared. So there will be a recording of this webinar, including all the content in it that is shared afterwards. All this content is also from the reports that were published. So maybe I can ask the backend team to also reshare the links to the reports that we've been presenting on today, just for easy access in the chat as well. But you'll see all the visuals and many, many more within those reports. All right, a few questions for the group. Kristen, I think I'm going to start with you. We had a question. In my experience, most restaurant and food service businesses don't think of themselves as producing food waste. Where is waste most commonly generated in this area? And do you have any training resources for food service and restaurants? We had a similar question just asking about when we'll have data for restaurants as well. So maybe you can tackle that collectively.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think having worked in food service, I feel like that's the biggest flag is when an operator says, "Oh no, we don't have waste." So we always know that when folks don't think they have waste, there's an opportunity for that waste to be tracked. So the common phrase goes, "You can't measure what you don't manage, or you can't manage what you don't measure." So I think a huge part for us is really encouraging restaurants and food service operators to track their waste. That's one of the practices we're seeing very commonly adopted across our signatories. We're seeing very high percentages of accounts and sites tracking food waste, which really allows us to get this level of granular data around overproduction, around unutilized ingredients that we can get down to the departmental level. So we know that in restaurants and food service, they're wasting about 4% of all of the food that they buy. So that's not a small percentage, and that translates to real dollars. So what we do know is that of that 4%, 22% of that is overproduction. So producing 3 trays of lasagna when only 2 are going to get eaten. So that's just a inventory and kind of projection issue. When we get into that 78% of unutilized ingredients, the biggest contributor to that was trimming and byproducts, which really speaks to opportunities for training around trim practices. So I think the 2 biggest areas of opportunities for training are really around waste trim practices as well as getting employees on board with food waste tracking. And we can drop a link in the chat. There's a really cool resource that we created a couple of years ago around gamifying food waste training. And we're working with our signatories really to make sure that we're helping them get the results of our pilots operationalized within their businesses. So that's a big area of opportunity for us this upcoming year. And I saw the question as well on QSR signatories. So QSR signatories are not reporting this year, but we're working with our current QSR signatories, including Starbucks, Wawa, Chick-fil-A, and Cava, to identify opportunities for measurement methodology best practices, anything that might be missing from our current methodology that doesn't represent their business. So we're in the process of working through that actually right now, and really excited to see the results of that. But like Tara mentioned earlier, we don't report unless we have a significant enough share of the market. So right now we don't have significant enough market share within QSR to publicly report.
Great. Thank you, Kristen, for walking us through that. And I love the point you brought up about in the first part of your answer of, you can't manage what you don't measure. And often that initial gut reaction of, oh, we don't waste food is actually really flagging an opportunity to start on the data side and looking at, okay, some of it may be harder to see and some of it may not be showing up in the areas that the businesses are reporting on now. And that is a really great opportunity to dive in and look at that. So thank you for walking us through that. All right, we had a lot of questions come in while you were answering, so I'm going to try and kind of get a good representative sample here. Tara, let's go to you for this next one. We had a couple questions around the whole chain pilots that you presented on, but one in particular, or maybe a couple I'm kind of combining here. was about, are there plans to conduct a study similar to the strawberries case study with a focus on produce grown in the Northeast US? But maybe you can respond to that and a few others similar by speaking just more generally to how we hope these projects do scale and or are used elsewhere across commodities or regions.
Sure. Thanks, Jackie. Yeah, our hope is that, by picking a particular commodity and testing it kind of nationally, touching down in different geographic locations, we can generate some broad learnings and insights and solutions that could be replicable in other areas or in other geographies. So, for example, the solution that we tested on strawberries, which was to take those off-grade strawberries that are edible but just not marketable and use them in food service locations where they can be processed, cut up, right, used in different kind of um, recipe settings. Like that's a solution that, could be implemented anywhere really globally or in the US. And so that's kind of our goal with doing these pilots, publishing the case studies, and then trying to scale the results. Um, and yeah, I think, but if always, if there's an interest in like a particular, commodity or area or location, like, please do reach out to us and talk to us about what you're thinking and where you see the opportunity. And we're happy to kind of discuss the learnings we've seen to date.
Great. Thank you. All right, I don't want David and Jalen getting too comfortable here. So let's take
Mhm.
them a question. There's a question about definitions on data. So how does the pack define wasted food? Can deferring to compost, using digesters, or feeding to animals be considered waste? So maybe you can talk a little bit about how we segment destinations and just how we think about reporting that through our pact reports.
Sure, I can take that one. So we get this question quite a bit, and the PACT reporting is focused on food surplus. So I'll start by defining food surplus and then get to your question about how we define wasted food. Food surplus is pretty much any and all food that goes unsold or unused and uneaten. So that includes parts that are inedible, like byproducts or trimmings that you'll see in the data in food service. And that is distinguished from how you've posed your question around food waste. So wasted food is something that we would consider, and the EPA would consider food that is intended for human use that ultimately goes to even all of the destinations that don't include compost, recycling, donation, animal feed. That would not be considered necessarily food waste, although it would be considered surplus food.
Great. Thank you, David. For those who have asked questions, just so you know, the team is also sending some links and resources through the chat and Q&A function. So if we don't get to yours, hopefully you can see some of those coming up through the chat. Kristen, let's go back to you for one on recruitment. Again, I'm going to combine a couple of questions here. So you highlighted that the pack nearly doubled in size last year, which is a really exciting milestone for us. Um, Multi-parts, answer what you want. First is, what do you think is driving that growth? What value do you think businesses are finding in the pact? Are there any plans to expand into schools? And maybe we kick that one over to Tara to talk about their broader work as well. And then do we imagine that we'll see more distributors joining the pack now that we've kind of opened up that area? So general recruitment updates and questions.
Yes, absolutely. So to take the first question, kind of why do we see this increase? I think a big piece of it is that the Pact offers benchmarking. We offer data and insights. That's a huge benefit to Pact signatories. I think the feedback that we've gotten is that we provide signatories with actionable data. So like we talked about the examples on trim and byproducts or overproduction, understanding where that waste is coming from and why really allows businesses to do that. I think also the business ecosystem is changing. Food waste is not really sustainability is not really as much a nice to have anymore. It's a core part of business efficiency. So we're seeing with the 4% in food service, we're seeing that there's real money to be saved in terms of executing on these operational efficiencies. I think also a lot of it is FOMO. So you have key players within the spaces, and this, goes to the question on distribution. Um, Really, you see a lot of positive energy moving in the right direction of, oh, my competitor is joining the pact. They're realizing operational savings. They're, gaining access to these collaborative convenings and speaking with their peers and competitors or customers. For in the example of distributors, we've had many distributors recently express interest because all of their customers are in the pact. So we're seeing a really positive trend in that direction. So yeah, and I'll hand it off with that to plans to expand to schools. Tara.
Sure, yeah, and I can say under the pact, we work with the nation's largest food service companies, Compass, Sodexo, Guggenheimer, others as well. SFI, who is a collaboration, represents a collaboration of university cafes and dining services. And so through those signatories, we are impacting the school space because they all have operations in kind of school areas there. And I think there's a lot of opportunity in the education space. I'll also say that WWF has a school-specific food loss and waste pillar called Food Waste Warriors. You should check it out. And it really tries to connect curriculum around food waste and what the kids are learning at school about it to cafeteria practices as well, such as setting up share tables, teaching kids about composting in real time and such. So check that out. It's called Food Waste Warriors.
Great. Thank you, Kristen and Tara. There was a question about learning more about proper waste trim practices. I just want to flag that a resource was shared in the Q&A box if other people are interested in that, if you want to go and take a look. This question, I think I'm going to open up for anyone to answer. It's about food recovery and food rescue. They said they represent a nonprofit focused on food rescue and are thrilled to see food donations increase. What do you think is driving that? Awareness, systems, connections, etc. I think we have both a data perspective and probably also an anecdotal perspective represented in this group. So I'll let anyone chime in on that who wants to.
I can start from the data perspective, noting that we saw a lot of increased data accuracy in destinations reporting in retail this year. So I think a lot of it was some of that awareness around and maybe enhanced specifically donation tracking. So something that would be classified as unknown prior is now able to be correctly put into the donations bucket. I'll pass it over to the PAC team for anecdotal answers.
Yeah, thanks, Jalen. Anyone else want to add anything? I think that was a pretty clear example, but Tara, Kristen, anything you want to add? Okay. All right, let's keep going here then. Great. Let's take this one to Kristen and Tara. I'll let you decide who wants to chime in on it. For organizations that have signed on to the pact, are they required to take steps to reduce food waste, or is it about participating in data collection? I think it'd be maybe great just to kind of outline base expectations and then maybe also just talk about some of the opportunities that they can layer on top of that.
Yeah, I can start and then hand it off to you, Tara, for anything that I missed. So the framework that the U.S. Food Waste Pact uses is Target Measure Act. So there are a number of yes to both of those and more. So in our target pillar, we encourage, although it's not required for organizations to have a food waste reduction goal. Sometimes that's nested under larger sustainability goals for climate. Like I said, that's preferred but not required. We do like to see that there's organizational alignment with sustainability and food waste reduction because we see that those are the companies that are more likely to implement and get things done and participate is when they have leadership support for that. Data collection is a very important piece. So for the sectors that we report publicly, food waste, food service, and retail, that is required. We're working on a number of subsectors as well as other sectors as well in terms of developing our data calculators and insights. So not every sector is required to publicly report at this juncture, but many signatories come to the pact because of the data and insights that we can provide to them in a granular manner, whether or not they're reporting publicly. And then the ACT portion really is important. So I think we focus most of our efforts in the measurement and acting portions of the Target Measure Act framework. So participation in pilots, we love to see signatories raising their hands who occupy an important node on the supply chain to implement solutions to see if it works and to test that out in the real world. We love to see folks participating in our collaborative convenings and being active participants and sharing information, not proprietary or cost information, but sharing insights and kind of taking a rising tide raises all boats approach to the sectors. So I would say data and goals and more. Tara, anything I missed?
No, I think you nailed it. Yeah, d data is one key pillar to the pact model, but the others are also important. The pre-competitive convenings to share knowledge and participating in interventions as well as able. So, yeah, I think you hit all the points.
All right, we have two questions that I think ultimately are going to be related back to our strawberry whole chain project. So, Tara, let me ask you the first one, and then Kristen, I'll ask you the second one. Um, Tara, it says, I was curious if you track or categorize data on cosmetically imperfect produce that is still edible but often gets discarded just because of how it looks. Since this happens so early in the supply chain, I'd love to hear of any initiatives or efforts being taken to address it. So, maybe using the strawberry case study as an example of how we do try to get into some of those insights.
Great. Yeah. And so our first strawberry case study found that 36% of the strawberry harvest was being left in the field and 25% was the edible but marketable. And so there's many ways to address that, right? Like folks have mentioned, like gleaning or donation. But and those are great and very important, but they don't always provide the business case for the farmer to use the labor, right, to get those berries out of the field, the extra labor that it would require. And so the challenge of our strawberry whole chain part two was really to figure out, can we set up a new market channel that provides a benefit to the grower and to the business as well, right? And so it was really a lot of kind of like playing with economics there and trying to figure out a whole brand new kind of supply chain channel that we could create. And I'm not sure I answered, there was another portion of that question as well, if you wouldn't
I
mind.
think you got it. It was mostly, yeah, just examples of, I think that is where we're getting the data
Yeah,
on that right now would be through our commodity specific
yeah.
whole chain projects, not necessarily more broadly. So thank you. Part two, Kristen, and maybe I'll transition to you for your role in this project, but who is responsible for the gathering and transportation of second tier strawberries to the food service locations for processing? Were growers paid for these products or were they donated or gleaned?
Yeah, great question. So, like the other whole chain projects, there are a variety of supply chain partners that we have to work with in order to get the product, from the field to the account. So, in this case, those supply chain partners included a grower, a produce broker who communicated and did pricing between the grower and the distributor, and then finally the distributor that our food service operators used, a common distributor that many of these accounts already use. So those relationships were pre-existing. And the growers were paid for the product. They were not donated or gleaned. We were hoping in the pilot to be able to demonstrate that there was financial impact or a financial benefit to the grower as well as environmental benefits as well.
Great, thank you. All right, I would like to go back to David and Jalen for a question. Did you see differences in trends depending on the size of the reporting entity? And were statistics just done on food overall, or were commodity items broken out separately?
Yeah, I can get us started, then Jalen, feel free to chime in. But I will start by saying that I can't share too much because this is anonymized aggregated reporting. But what I can share is for trends we saw in food service specifically. So we actually took an approach that is new this year in food service that took into account site size and representation of the broader business. And yes, in the report, we share that we did see that sites that are generally larger, higher prioritized for the business end up being the ones that measure food waste. And therefore, by measuring food waste, they actually end up having less food waste overall. So I think it's fair to say that the larger players, the ones that have the resources to invest in measurement, are doing better now. But I think our goal going forward is not just to help those that are the biggest players, but how do we provide resources to people who are smaller businesses or operations as well.
Awesome,
Great.
and I
Jalen,
can
anything? Yeah,
chime
great.
in on the specificity. We do our reporting and benchmarking at the food department level, so not quite at that food item or specific commodity, but categories like breads and bakery, produce, fresh meat and seafood, etc.
Great. Thank you. Maybe David and Jalen, while you're unmuted, this is probably a quick one, but there was a question, and this was probably from my own poor articulation of data earlier of how do we think about the difference between recovered and rescued food? Do you just want to talk about that destination and what we include in there?
Yeah, yeah. So these are actually like colloquially used interchangeably. I think in policy circles, we talk about food recovery. Food rescue is often intended for the purpose of donations specifically. But you could use food recovery as including um, uh, diversion tactics that go to animal feed, for example. Rescue often focusing on donations, but most often people use food recovery and food rescue specifically for donations.
Thank you for clarifying that. All right, I have kind of a fun, unique question, maybe, and then I'm going to end with my one after that. So, second to last question, Kristen, I'm going to put you on the spot for this one. How can zoos and aquariums help by utilizing surplus food that is safe for animals to eat?
Yeah, I just dropped an answer in the chat to that.
Oh, great. Okay.
In my experience, I haven't seen that in practice. I know it's much more common for animal feed to go towards livestock. I know there. I am not an expert by any means on this question, but I know that there's a federal statute that governs this. Then there's also kind of a patchwork of state laws that also govern this. And there's a lot of complication in terms of depending on what source you have for that food, how that gets, you know, coalesced and packaged in a way that's safe for animals to eat. But I'll hand it over to Tara for some exciting work that we're doing in this space.
Yeah, I got excited by this question because it's also something that our retailers are really wanting to dig into this year. Maybe not exactly for zoos and aquariums, but I think that would be just like a really cool bonus. But definitely animal feed. That is like a big topic, top of mind for kind of retailers of how do they take food that's currently going to landfill and move it up the chain there into animal feed, right? If it can't be donated, then that is a next option. And in the retail space, it's just not as well defined or explored, this kind of like waste to animal feed pathway. Manufacturing has much for certain reasons that lead to it being easier in that sector has much clearer lines to kind of animal feed channels. So basically, long story short, this next year we're going to be gathering kind of a task force of retailers wanting to work on retail waste to animal feed, and we hope to have a better answer for you at this call next year on that topic.
Wow, what a perfect segue, Tara. You can't use that same answer because my closing question to the group was I hope to be back a year from now hosting this call for 2025 progress and wanted the closing question to be what is one thing that you hope we can share on this call next year? Tara and Kristen. David and Jalen, you're welcome to chime in too if you want to.
I'll say that 2026, a lot of what we're doing has really been taking our time to kind of think about, okay, we've seen some great success in our whole chain case studies and work, our employee engagement, our low waste events. Now, how do we scale? We're really kind of pushing ourselves to think about how do we help signatories, other businesses, other groups outside of the private sector help scale these solutions? And it's a really challenging question to ask. And we're trying to be really thoughtful about it, and kind of establishing new strategies like launching task forces and industry groups around it, and different kind of formats of pilots that we aim to test this year. So it's been kind of like a brewing and stewing sort of period for us in this early Q1 2026. I'm really excited to see kind of what new strategies we implement in the year ahead.
Love that. Thank you. Kristen?
Yeah, building on what Tara said, I think that I'm really excited about all the new signatories that have joined us and what that opens up in terms of opportunities for pilots across the supply chain. Western Growers Association, International Fresh Produce Association, joining as representing in the grower producer node. That's really exciting to us. I think having more distributors on board that is a really exciting piece of the supply chain. We're seeing great momentum in QSR and hope to see more signatories join there. To Tara's point, I think really what we're seeing is like, how can we deepen the signatory experience and not only serve the signatories that are part of the pact, but also have those learnings benefit the larger food business ecosystem. Um, and yeah, I just see there being so many areas of opportunities, especially in how we help signatories and other businesses as well operationalize on the learnings from the case studies and pilots that we're putting forth. So making sure that we're solidifying those learnings in operations within businesses across the food business ecosystem.
Thanks, Kristen. David, I saw you come off mute. Please.
Just wanted to put the plug that we're very eager to expand on our reporting efforts now that Jalen's on board and doing her second year of data collection and reporting, mainly around making the metrics that we collect more specific and actionable for businesses. So if you're a food business and have ideas or feedback on our data collection and reporting, please reach out.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you everyone so much for the questions and for the engagement. With that, we are going to bring our webinar to a close. We appreciate you taking the time to hear all about this annual effort. You can read both the impact report and the data report that were referenced today on the ReFed website and the US Food Waste Pact website. And if you have any questions in the meantime, please feel free to email our colleague Kristen Lee, whose email is right there at the bottom of the slide. This work doesn't happen in a vacuum, so we want to thank certainly all of our signatories that are on the line today and other partners that have supported us, as well as all of you that are doing work in your own spheres of influence. So thank you and hope you have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.